A recurring historical phenomenon has led to the downfall of three major empires, all brought down by excessive debt. In the year 2025, the United States appears to be replicating this exact pattern. Increment by increment, with trillions of dollars accumulating, it's as if we're following a preordained path toward insolvency and ruin. Back in the 1600s, Spain commanded dominion over the most lucrative silver mines ever discovered, amassing a fortune unparalleled by any preceding nation. Yet within a century and a half, Spain had defaulted on its financial obligations 4 times. The very empire that controlled half the world's silver supply found itself unable to meet its financial commitments. Centuries later, in the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire spanned vast territories, reigning from Vienna all the way to Yemen. This empire, 600 years in existence and governing millions, faced ruin. By 1875, it declared bankruptcy, its finances seized by European creditors, transforming it into a subservient debtor nation. Within 50 years, its existence concluded. In 1990, Japan stood as the second largest economy globally, acquiring prestigious assets like Rockefeller Center and Hollywood studios. The prevailing consensus predicted Japan's ascendant rise to surpass the United States. Then its financial bubble imploded. 35 years later, the nation has yet to fully recover, with a debt-to-gross domestic product ratio standing at 264%, and an entire generation mired in economic stagnation. 3 empires, each ensnared in a cycle of escalating debt, each instance where borrowing for advancement ultimately resulted in fiscal collapse. What should truly concern you is this: the current debt of the United States exceeds the combined debt of those 3 empires at their respective peaks. $36 trillion and counting. The annual interest payments alone have surpassed $1.1 trillion, exceeding our defense expenditures. Furthermore, we continue to borrow an additional $2 trillion annually merely to maintain current operations. We are not merely approaching a debt crisis, we are already in the 5th of 7 stages. History indicates that stages 6 and 7 unfold with alarming rapidity. This is the narrative of how empires bankrupt themselves through debt, the rationale behind their persistent belief in managing it, and why the financial realities suggest we are next. Before dissecting this historical pattern, it is crucial to comprehend what constitutes a debt spiral. It is not merely an abstract economic theory. In practice, a nation trapped in such a spiral does not typically begin with a crisis. Instead, it emerges from a period of success and growth, fueled by the rational expectation that borrowed funds for investment will yield positive returns. This investment might be directed towards infrastructure development, military expansion, or future technological advancements. For a time, this strategy appears to work. The borrowed capital stimulates economic expansion, which in turn generates tax revenue, and this revenue is then utilized to service the debt. This cycle is sustainable until growth falters. When economic expansion decelerates or investments fail to meet expectations, the existing debt remains and interest payments are still due. Governments then confront a critical decision: reduce expenditures to align with revenue, increase taxation to service the debt, or borrow additional funds to cover the shortfall. Fiscal austerity typically precipitates economic recession, while tax increases often prove politically unfeasible. Consequently, governments opt to borrow further. This marks the inception of the spiral. When borrowing is employed to meet obligations from previous debts, it ceases to be investment and becomes mere postponement of the inevitable crisis. The debt escalates at a pace exceeding economic growth, leading to an ever larger proportion of the budget being allocated to interest payments. This leaves diminished resources for other essential functions, necessitating further borrowing until lenders eventually lose faith in the nation's ability to repay. At this juncture, when confidence evaporates and bond markets refuse to extend credit, only 2 dire options remain: outright default or currency devaluation to settle debts, rendering the money worthless. Both outcomes are economically ruinous and herald the demise of the empire. This is not hypothetical. This is precisely what befell Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan in 3 distinct historical instances, each following an identical trajectory. Let us first examine the initial great debt spiral, that of Spain, spanning from 1500 to 1650. This represents the foundational blueprint. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas opened a new world for Spain. Over the subsequent 50 years, Spanish conquistadors subjugated the Aztec and Inca empires, gaining control of the most abundant gold and silver deposits ever unearthed. The Potosi silver mine in Bolivia alone yielded an astonishing 45,000 tons of silver over 2 centuries. Spain minted this precious metal into currency, becoming the wealthiest nation on earth. By the early 1600s, Spain stood as a preeminent global power. King Charles V governed not only Spain but also the Netherlands, Austria, portions of Italy, and all of Spanish America, a dominion so vast that the sun never set upon it. All this imperial might came at a considerable expense. This marks stage 1 of the debt spiral, borrowing for expansion. Charles V was engaged in perpetual warfare against France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant factions within Germany. Conflicts waged on multiple fronts across continents, each demanding substantial military forces, naval assets, weaponry, and provisions. To finance these endeavors, Charles resorted to borrowing extensively from German, Italian, and other international financiers. His collateral was the silver flowing from the Americas, reassuring lenders of Spain's repayment capacity. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain's borrowing increased, and so did its empire, creating the illusion of manageable growth. This illusion persisted until it could no longer be sustained, leading to stage 2. Economic growth decelerates, but expenditures do not. By the mid-1600s, Spain's military campaigns were costing more than its silver revenues could cover. King Philip II, Charles's son, inherited the throne in 1556, along with a staggering debt of 36 million ducats, equivalent to approximately $3 billion in today's currency, an immense sum for that era. Philip II continued to spend lavishly, engaging in conflicts against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, attempting to invade England with the Spanish Armada, and prosecuting a brutal 80-year war to suppress the Dutch rebellion. All these costly ventures were financed through debt. By 1557, merely 1 year into his reign, Philip found himself unable to meet his financial obligations. Annual tax revenues amounted to 7 million ducats, while debt servicing alone consumed 5 million, meaning interest payments absorbed 70% of the government's total revenue. In September 1557, Philip II declared Spain bankrupt, suspending all debt payments and unilaterally restructuring its loans, converting them into long-term bonds with reduced interest rates. The bankers were left with little choice but to accept the restructuring or receive nothing. This constitutes stage 3, borrowing to service previous debts, initiating the Ponzi phase. However, sovereign defaults do not resolve underlying issues. They merely reset the timeline. Philip still required funds for his ongoing wars. Thus, following the default, he resumed borrowing, and remarkably, lenders extended credit to him once more. The reason for this renewed lending was Spain's continued access to its silver mines. Lenders convinced themselves that this time would be different, a belief that proved unfounded. In 1560, Philip defaulted again. Just 3 years later, in 1575, a third default occurred, followed by a fourth in 1596. This amounted to 4 bankruptcies within a span of 40 years. Each time, Philip pledged reforms, yet he invariably reverted to borrowing and spending, exacerbating the debt spiral. This leads to stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable, and the mathematics fail. By the conclusion of Philip's reign in 1598, debt servicing consumed 100% of the government's revenue, with every incoming ducat directed solely to creditors. This left no funds for governmental operations, military upkeep, or any other essential expenditures. Their only recourse was to borrow more. However, lenders, recognizing Spain's precarious financial standing, imposed exorbitant interest rates of 18 to 20%. When interest payments surpass total revenue, a nation becomes mathematically insolvent, effectively a zombie empire, a walking dead entity. This is stage 5. Lenders lose confidence and credit freezes. By the early 1600s, financiers were either refusing to lend to Spain or demanding interest rates so high that further borrowing only worsened the situation. Spain resorted to debasing its currency, introducing copper into its silver coins. Coins that should have been pure silver were now 50% copper. This represented inflation through deception, which shattered trust in the Spanish currency. Prices skyrocketed. An item costing 1 coin in 1600 demanded 10 coins by 1650. The economy ground to a halt, and trade collapsed. The silver extracted from the Americas flowed out of Spain immediately to finance imports. Spain produced virtually nothing domestically, becoming reliant on goods from France, England, and the Netherlands, nations that were actively building their industries while Spain merely extracted and consumed. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal, which had been united under the Spanish crown. By 1648, through the Treaty of Westphalia, which concluded 80 years of conflict, Spain ceded the Netherlands, achieving nothing tangible from the prolonged war. By 1650, Spain had been relegated to a second-tier power, impoverished, diminished, and irrelevant. This is stage 6, default, austerity, or hyperinflation. Spain opted for a protracted decline characterized by inflation and repeated defaults. While the empire did not experience a complete collapse, neither did it achieve recovery. The realm that once possessed half the world's wealth became a stark, cautionary tale. The lesson derived from Spain's experience is that even boundless resources cannot avert ruin if spending consistently outstrips revenue. The silver poured into Spain flowed directly back out to creditors, and the escalating debt spiral dismantled the greatest empire of its era. However, Spain's plight occurred centuries ago. Surely modern governments learned from this historical precedent. The Ottoman Empire's trajectory demonstrates they did not. Let us now advance 250 years to the Ottoman Empire, from 1850 to 1923. In 1850, the Ottoman Empire remained a vast entity, stretching from the Balkans to Arabia and from North Africa to Mesopotamia. Having endured for over 500 years, the empire was nonetheless in decline. It had suffered military defeats against Russia, lost territories in Europe, and was engaged in a desperate effort to modernize. Modernization, however, necessitates significant financial investment. This brings us to stage 1, borrowing for growth and military enhancement. During the 1850s, the Ottoman government initiated a series of borrowings from European financial institutions in France, Britain, and Germany. These loans were earmarked for military modernization, the construction of railways, telegraph lines, and port facilities, essential components of a modern state. Ottoman leaders genuinely believed that modernization would restore the empire's former power. Foreign lenders, in turn, subscribed to the notion that the Ottoman Empire was too substantial to fail. It served the strategic interests of Christian European powers to maintain Ottoman solvency as a bulwark against Russian expansion. Consequently, European governments actively encouraged lending. The first Ottoman foreign loan was secured in 1854, amounting to 3 million sterling at an interest rate of 6%, to finance the Crimean War. The Ottomans successfully repaid this loan, prompting lenders to issue further credits. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire had accumulated borrowings totaling £200 million sterling, equivalent to approximately $30 billion in contemporary value. For an empire with limited industrial capacity and declining tax revenues, this level of debt was unsustainable. This leads to stage 2. Economic growth falters, but expenditures persist. The modernization initiatives failed to generate the anticipated economic growth for the Ottomans. While railways were constructed, they did not foster industrial development. The military was modernized, yet the empire continued to lose wars. Furthermore, a significant portion of the borrowed funds was illicitly diverted by corrupt officials or squandered on lavish expenditures for the Sultan's court. Sultan Abdulaziz, for instance, commissioned the construction of opulent palaces, while the state treasury remained depleted. Concurrently, the empire's territorial extent continued to shrink. Provinces in the Balkans were lost and control over Egypt was relinquished. Tax revenues were diminishing, while debt repayment obligations were escalating. By 1873, the Ottoman government was allocating 50% of its revenue to debt servicing, meaning half of all collected funds were directed to European creditors. This marks stage 3, borrowing to repay prior debts, the classic Ponzi scheme. By the early 1870s, the Ottomans were compelled to secure new loans solely to meet the interest payments on existing ones. Lenders were aware of this precarious situation, yet they continued to extend credit, believing that European governments would intervene to support the Ottomans, thereby preventing Russian encroachment. In October 1875, the Ottoman Empire declared bankruptcy, unable to meet its debt obligations. This constitutes a default. This leads to stage 4, unsustainable interest payments, and the breakdown of fiscal logic. However, unlike Spain's situation, the Ottoman default did not involve a negotiated restructuring. European creditors assumed direct control. In 1881, the Ottoman Empire enacted the Decree of Muharrem, establishing the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. European creditors now directly managed Ottoman finances, assuming responsibility for tax collection in specific provinces and controlling customs revenues, thereby dictating how funds were disbursed. The Ottoman Empire had effectively become a debtor nation, technically sovereign, yet economically beholden to foreign creditors. This signifies stage 5. Lenders lose confidence and foreign control is established. For the subsequent 30 years, European creditors systematically extracted wealth from Ottoman territories. The Ottoman government was no longer able to secure loans or invest in its future. It could barely cover basic administrative expenses. Lacking financial resources, it could not maintain its authority. Provinces began to break away. Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania all achieved independence. European powers subsequently began to partition Ottoman territories, with France taking control of Lebanon, Britain acquiring Egypt and Cyprus, and Italy annexing Libya. The empire was progressively dismantled by its creditors. The First World War served as the final blow. The Ottomans aligned with Germany, ultimately losing the war. The empire was formally dissolved in 1923, following the Treaty of Lausanne. This represents stages 6 and 7, default leading to collapse and dissolution. Now let us examine the most recent instance, Japan, from 1990 to the present day. This case is particularly instructive because Japan is currently navigating this debt spiral. During the 1980s, Japan experienced unprecedented economic expansion, with its economy growing at a rate of 10% annually. Japanese corporations were acquiring iconic global landmarks. Sony purchased Columbia Pictures, and Mitsubishi bought Rockefeller Center. Japanese automobiles and electronics dominated international markets, leading to widespread predictions that Japan would overtake the United States as the world's preeminent economy. Then the bubble burst. This represents stage 1, borrowing for growth, albeit in a speculative bubble. Throughout the 1980s, Japanese real estate and stock prices experienced an explosive surge. The land occupied by the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was theoretically valued more highly than all the real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index climbed from 7,000 in 1980 to 38,915 by December 1989. This remarkable ascent was not founded on intrinsic economic fundamentals, but rather on speculation fueled by readily available credit. Banks engaged in reckless lending, corporations accumulated massive debt, and the prevailing sentiment was that prices would continue to rise indefinitely, a conviction that proved tragically mistaken. This leads to stage 3, borrowing to finance a response to the crisis. Throughout the 1990s, Japan attempted to stimulate its economy through government spending. Every economic slowdown was met with new stimulus packages involving increased borrowing and mounting debt. This strategy proved ineffective because the fundamental issue, the pervasive bad debts within the banking system, was never adequately addressed. Insolvent companies, kept afloat by cheap loans, clogged the economy, failing to invest, create jobs, or achieve growth. They merely existed, consuming resources that could have. This practice is known as debt monetization, where the government issues bonds and the central bank acquires them using newly created currency. This mechanism has kept interest rates near zero. Consequently, despite Japan's debt to GDP ratio of 264%, its interest payments amount to less than 2% of GDP, owing to artificially suppressed interest rates. However, this arrangement remains viable only as long as inflation remains low and confidence in the currency persists. Should inflation emerge, interest rates would inevitably rise. An increase to even 2% would cause Japan's interest payments to consume 5% of its GDP. At a higher rate, they would consume 13% of GDP, rendering the national budget unmanageable. This represents stage 5, trapped in the spiral, unable to escape. This is Japan's current predicament. It cannot raise interest rates without jeopardizing its budget, yet maintaining them at zero indefinitely risks devaluing its currency. Government spending cannot be curtailed due to an aging population and escalating social security costs. Furthermore, economic growth is hampered by a declining birth rate and shrinking population. Japan's population peaked in 2008 at 128 million and has since fallen to 123 million. Projections indicate it will drop below 100 million by 2050. A smaller workforce and tax base, coupled with an increasing number of retirees requiring benefits, create an untenable demographic and fiscal equation. Japan is ensnared in a debt trap, a situation it has endured for 35 years. Unlike Spain or the Ottomans, Japan is not experiencing a dramatic collapse. Instead, it is undergoing a prolonged period of stagnation and slow decline. Wages have remained stagnant since 1990, with an entire generation having spent their entire working lives in economic inertia. Young people struggle to afford housing and start families, with a birth rate of 1.3, significantly below the replacement level. The nation is slowly fading away. This corresponds to stages 6 and 7. Japan has not yet reached these ultimate stages. It remains entrenched in stage 5. However, the historical pattern suggests that stage 6 is imminent. This could manifest as default, which is improbable for Japan as it borrows in its own currency, or hyperinflation, should the currency ultimately collapse under the weight of excessive monetary printing, or the continuation of lost decades evolving into a lost century. The lesson from Japan's experience is that modern monetary maneuvers can postpone a debt spiral, but cannot prevent its eventual manifestation. Japan has bought time, 35 years of it, yet the debt persists. Demographics continue to deteriorate, and the fundamental financial mathematics remain insurmountable. 3 empires, 3 distinct debt spirals: Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. Despite differing centuries and circumstances, all adhered to an identical 7-stage progression. Let us meticulously examine this pattern, for once understood, it becomes clear why the United States currently finds itself in stage 5. Stage 1. Borrowing for productive investment or expansion. Every debt spiral commences with what appears to be prudent borrowing. Spain financed its empire and wars, the Ottomans invested in modernization, and Japan borrowed to recover from a speculative bubble. Initially, these actions seemed judicious, leveraging external capital for growth. This strategy remains viable until stage 2. Economic growth slows, but spending continues unabated. Spain's wars ceased generating sufficient profits. The Ottoman Empire's modernization efforts did not translate into economic expansion. Japan's stimulus packages failed to reignite its economy. In all 3 instances, expenditures continued because reducing them proved politically unfeasible and economically counterproductive during periods of slow growth. Consequently, they persisted in their spending. Status achieved. Stage 3. Borrowing to service previous debts. The Ponzi phase. This is a critical juncture. When borrowing is no longer for investment but solely to cover interest on existing debt, the nation is operating within a Ponzi scheme. Spain engaged in this practice for 150 years, the Ottomans for 30 years, and Japan has been doing so for 35 years. The United States is currently in this phase. Status achieved. Stage 4. Interest payments become unsustainable, and the mathematical foundations crumble. When debt servicing consumes between 30 and 50% of national revenue, a government loses its capacity to function effectively. Spain reached this point in the 1990s. The Ottomans faced this reality in the 1870s. Japan managed to circumvent this by printing money to maintain 0 interest rates. The United States has just surpassed $1.1 trillion in annual interest payments, representing 15% of its tax revenue. This occurs while interest rates remain relatively low. If rates were to revert to historical averages, our interest payments would double to $2 trillion, consuming 30% of our revenue. We are entering stage 4 at this moment. Status achieved. Stage 5. Lenders lose confidence or the government becomes trapped. Spain encountered this in the 1600s when lenders refused further credit. The Ottomans faced it in 1875, culminating in their default. Japan is currently trapped in this stage, unable to raise interest rates without destabilizing its budget. The United States is witnessing a gradual reduction in dollar holdings by foreign creditors. China, for instance, has decreased its U.S. Treasury holdings by $300 billion since 2021. Global confidence is slowly eroding, but it is indeed diminishing. We are in stage 5. Status achieved. Stage 6. Default, hyperinflation, or prolonged stagnation. This is the stage where outcomes are invariably negative. Spain experienced 4 defaults and subsequent imperial decline. The Ottomans faced default, foreign domination, and eventual dissolution. Japan has endured 35 years of stagnation, and this period continues. The United States has not yet reached stage 6, but the established pattern indicates its inevitability as the financial realities are unsustainable. Stage 7. Economic collapse or permanent decline. Spain never recovered its former glory. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. Japan has been permanently diminished in its global standing. Upon reaching stage 7, an empire's era is definitively over. While a nation may persist, its power, prosperity, and future prospects are irrevocably lost. That is the historical pattern. 7 stages, 3 empires, all following the same sequence. And now, the United States. Let us examine our present situation. Stages 1 and 2 are long in the past. We commenced substantial borrowing in the 1980s under President Reagan. The national debt stood at $900 billion in 1980. It has now reached $36 trillion. We borrowed for military expansion, social programs, tax reductions, and virtually every other conceivable expenditure. Status: achieved. Stage 2: growth slowed, but spending did not. The average annual economic expansion hovered around 4% throughout the 1960s, then settled at 3% during the 1980s and 1990s, before slowing to 2% in the 2000s and the 2010s, and further decelerating to 1.5% in the 2020s. Despite this deceleration in output, expenditures continue to climb. In just 2 decades, our financial plans have ballooned from $2 trillion to $6 trillion. Consider that fact. This marks the third phase. We are now incurring new debt to service obligations from past borrowing. Of the $2 trillion we finance each year, an estimated $1.1 trillion is earmarked solely for interest payments. We've entered the realm of a Ponzi scheme. Indeed, this brings us to the 4th stage. Interest obligations become unmanageable. Currently, the interest alone amounts to $1.1 trillion annually. This figure surpasses our defense budget and our Medicare expenditures, and it is still climbing. Should interest rates revert to their historical mean of 5%, our interest payments would surge to $2 trillion. This represents 30% of our national income. This situation is unsustainable. We are on the cusp of entering the 4th stage right now. Now stage 5. Creditors begin to lose faith. Nations such as China, Russia, and others are diminishing their holdings of US dollars. They are transitioning towards gold and establishing alternative transaction frameworks. The BRICS alliance is actively developing a currency that could rival the dollar. The global community is bracing for potential economic instability in the United States. We are currently in stage 5. This is our present reality. The pertinent question now is how much time remains until we reach stage 6? It could be approximately 5 years, or perhaps 10. However, the numerical projections indicate its inevitability. Here's why. Our current national debt stands at $36 trillion. We are adding $2 trillion to this burden each year. Interest rates are at historic lows, and we are already allocating $1.1 trillion annually to interest. If rates were to climb to 5%, our interest expenses would skyrocket to $2 trillion. If the debt continues its current trajectory of expansion, we will face a $50 trillion debt by the year 2030. At a 5% interest rate, this translates to $2.5 trillion in annual interest payments alone. This does not even account for any repayment of the principal amount, only the interest. This sum would consume 40% of our tax receipts. Economic growth alone cannot rectify this predicament. We would require sustained growth of 6 to 7% of our gross domestic product for several decades, a rate not witnessed since the 1960s. Reductions in spending also offer no viable solution. By the year 2030, our commitments to Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments will collectively exceed our tax revenue. All other expenditures, including defense, education, and infrastructure, would require further borrowing. Politically, there is no achievable solution. Neither major political party demonstrates a willingness to curb spending. The Republican Party shows no inclination to reduce defense or Social Security outlays. Conversely, the Democratic Party is unwilling to curtail social programs. No entity is prepared to implement tax increases of a magnitude sufficient to make a meaningful difference. The fundamental arithmetic is unsound. The political landscape is insurmountable. An historical precedent dictates that stage 6 is unavoidable. 3 historical empires followed this 7-stage debt-induced demise: Spain, the Ottoman Empire, and Japan. Each, in its time, believed its circumstances were unique. Spain placed its faith in its silver wealth. The Ottomans anticipated intervention from European powers. Japan was convinced it could continuously print currency without repercussions. All were mistaken. The established pattern prevailed, and the United States now believes itself to be exceptional. We possess the world's reserve currency. We command the largest economy. We are, after all, America. However, this pattern is indifferent to notions of exceptionalism. It is a mathematical certainty. One cannot indefinitely finance expenditures exceeding one's production capacity through borrowing. Debt servicing cannot perpetually outstrip revenue, and once an entity enters stage 5, escape from this spiral becomes impossible. 3 empires serve as irrefutable proof, and we are mirroring their exact trajectory. The sole uncertainty lies in the timeline. How much longer until stage 6? How long until investors cease purchasing treasury bonds? How long until the Federal Reserve is compelled to engage in excessive money printing, triggering hyperinflation? How long until the financial calculations definitively collapse? Perhaps we have years. Perhaps we are closer to this precipice than anyone dares to acknowledge. Yet the established pattern indicates its arrival. And when it does, when the United States reaches stage 6 and 7, the decline will not be gradual. It will be a cataclysm that renders the financial crisis of 2008 a mere prelude. This is because, on this occasion, the entirety of the global financial framework is predicated upon United States debt. When we falter, the world economy falters with us. 3 empires, 3 debt spirals, 3 stark warnings, etched in the annals of bankruptcy and collapse. The pattern is absolute. The mathematical principles are immutable. And history, having observed Spain, the Ottomans, and Japan traverse this precise sequence, suggests we are next. If this analysis has illuminated your understanding of our current position within this cycle, please subscribe. Because when stage 6 is upon us, when the debt crisis becomes undeniably apparent, you will wish to comprehend what has transpired and the reasons behind it. The answers are not concealed in the future, they are chronicled in the past, and I will guide you to them.